And there you go. And to summarize feedback and provide next steps to implement a functional pilot in your jurisdiction. And the goal for this meeting and this process is to use decision intelligence to make more informed and equitable decisions before, during, and after disaster. So your feedback is welcome and highly encouraged throughout this process. All right, you probably have seen this before, but based on our previous webinars and workshops, we want to ensure you're familiar with some of our resources to find information and stay connected. So if you haven't already, please sign up to our functional pilot, and we're providing Alexa, thank you, the links in the chat, as well to our first hour of our second workshop, where we frame the challenge in our second workshop, and then join our Equitable Decision Intelligence LinkedIn group. We'll include this links in the chat, and then if you have any questions, please always remember to reach us at equity@spinglobal.org. Okay, so in terms of the purpose and intended outcomes of today's meetings, in the next 45 minutes, we want to recap the comments, conversation, and just the contributions from previous workshops and feedback, and also to launch development of the world's first open source equitable decision intelligence model in 2022, and to continue the discussion on how decision intelligence can help address emergency management challenges in participants' jurisdictions, and to highlight the relevance of this topic. So we will discuss what the functional pilot would look like, and what you should expect if you want to participate in a pilot, and just overall next steps in this process. So I'm going to turn it over to Joel Thomas and Eric Kent from Spin Global, who will discuss key findings.
Excellent. Thank you, Camila, and good to be with you all this morning or afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're in. You can go to the next slide, please. As Camila said, wanted to spend a little bit of time recapping sort of where we come thus far. And you recall we had our sort of inaugural webinar in just a couple of months ago and in October. And since then, we've had a couple of workshops. We've had a number of folks participate in those efforts from across the country and even throughout the world. This map here shows you just a little bit of sort of where the participants have come from. You can sort of see East Coast, West Coast, a little bit of Midwest, and then the South as well. We had a dominant representation from local cities, counties. A number of states have joined us, and a number of national and federal organizations. And so all in, we've had several dozen participants in these workshops contributing. So what we're going to do today is really sort of present back some of the highlighted themes across the conversations that were had, and use that to help introduce what we're going to do here as we develop an open source model that we're planning to publish in the first quarter of 2022. So next slide, please. You can see just a snapshot. There were, like I said, dozens of attendees, but from Maryland to Texas, Arizona to Michigan, FEMA, HHS, HUD, New York City to Houston, Washington, D.C., Sonoma County, and educational institutions as well, colleges across the country. We had quite a number of representatives from across the country who participated and contributed their thoughts as we went through some scenario-based discussions. We're going to go to the next slide, please. As we talked in the workshops, we sort of had a couple of key discussions. One that was sort of pre-boom, sort of pre-disaster planning and preparedness, and then we had some discussions that were in the response and recovery side. And Nisim is going to talk a little bit later about the scope of where we're going to focus based upon feedback from you all and from the other participants who showed up, as we have plans to launch a handful of pilots in the first quarter this coming year. We're going to be focusing heavily on this pre-disaster planning and preparedness aspect. And really, there were sort of three themes that bubbled up to the top as we looked at what were the points of interest for different participants in the workshops. That included an emphasis on vulnerable populations, looking at sort of various demographics, whether it be individuals with access and functional needs, low income, individuals, looking by various through various lenses of race and historical marginalization, or looking at communities that have been underserved over time, and looking at the intersection of some of the needs, dominant needs like evacuation. How do we handle things like that, and housing and sheltering, communications, and even economic development? How do we do that more intentionally? But the whole idea here is really to have clarity and define and be able to understand in a community what is the composition of our community, who comprises our community, where are they located, what are the needs of the different populations in our communities, and when we overlay and look at various hazard scenarios that we plan for, how does that inform our way forward? And do our plans actually account for fully supporting the needs of the vulnerable populations in a community? Another aspect that was a big theme was climate migration impacts on equity, and looking how there's people who are concentrated in different cities across the United States that might be from outside of the country, and so this leads to language barriers. And when we talk about communication and also cultural barriers and different responses to emergency planning and messaging in general. And so how do we engage with communities who've migrated and the impacts on our communities? And then another major theme that emerged was the emergency management workforce. Is it representative of the population served? Do we have the is it representative? Do we have the cultural competencies and skill sets? Are we communicating in ways that are accessible and relatable to the populations that we serve? And so looking at a number of those indicators. And so there's a lot that was discussed and discovered in that process. And what Nisim's going to introduce to you is sort of how we're going to take these themes and focus on model development through a number of different models that are being developed to look at the intersection of these different factors in pre-disaster planning and preparedness. Next slide, please. We also discussed response and recovery. And we talked about, as I've mentioned a little bit already, effective communication and engagement with the population, how we do outreach and engage individuals and families with specific needs. We talked about asking the community because they may have and know some of the solutions. We talked about return on investment of engagement. We talked a lot about data collection. Where is the data coming from? Is the data biased, and to what extent? When we collect data, it's often collected with a particular perspective or a method. And are we ready and willing to evaluate the ways in which we're collecting data and understand where it needs to be augmented and or new data collection efforts need to ensue? And where might combinations of existing data sets put together provide new insights and new meaning that'll help us get, move towards a more equitable response and recovery? We talked about, sort of being proactive versus reactive, building trusted communications, looking at the interconnectedness of everything that connects a community, looking at the connection between preparedness and jobs and businesses being open and closed, and that effect on the economy. We also talked about property damage, creating inequities, and looked at, how we often prioritize through our current methods places where real estate's more valuable based upon benefit cost analyses and other methods. And so how do we actually administer programs in ways that recognizes inequities, that recognizes and identifies ways to fund solutions that helped historically marginalized or disadvantaged communities be able to respond and recover more effectively. So, this is just a very high gloss level. There were so many comments and discussions there, but we're going to focus on principally this preparedness, planning, and mitigation side of the house. So let's go to the next slide. And I want to introduce to you sort of the scope of what we're going to do for these functional pilots. At the conclusion of the workshops, we invited and said, who's interested? Show of hands in a functional pilot. And we've had about 5 or 6 jurisdictions step forward who said, I'm interested, from large cities to counties, states, et cetera. And we're going to be looking at, in the new year in January, initiating those functional pilots. And I want to spend the next few minutes talking about sort of expectations. What is a functional pilot? What's our goal? What are the purpose and outcomes of this pilot? And really also invite others if others want to participate as an observer or or still would like to request a pilot. That's still an option for you. So let's go to the next slide. Really, these workshops have been a kicking off point, right, for discussions that are necessary. And what we want to do now is spend some time with an organization to actually gather requirements that are specific to their community. So let's get beyond sort of, thematic requirements and thematic ideas around, data collection and equity and better, more, better preparedness, response, recovery. And let's actually look at the specific requirements in the community. And then from there, we're going to look to design and tailor the design of an open source model and metrics that will serve as a foundation for the development of a model that will ultimately allow and enable leaders to make better decisions before, during, and after disasters. So at the end of the day, we're going to be working to identify those requirements, identify the available data, configure it, add in metrics that really press into making more equitable decisions. And Nisim will touch on a little bit of that today in his talk. And then ultimately test it. And so let's actually test and evaluate. Okay, if we actually implement this model, does it yield those recommendations that highlight opportunities to serve our communities more effectively and to do so in a way that is different than we've sort of done in the past and serves those most vulnerable populations. And so it's requirements gathering, it's design and the modeling and metrics and validation of those metrics, and then it's test and evaluate that model using your jurisdiction's data to actually input to the process and sort of see what comes out the other side, and then sort of say, okay, we thought this model would yield these results. And we talked about in the workshops, using Markov chain and creating literally hundreds and even 1,000 simulation of options in minutes, what can take days, coming up with simple executable recommendations, before a disaster. Here's opportunities to improve the way you do planning, and here's opportunities for mitigation that you might consider, and looking at those recommendations. Next slide, please. So in terms of the pilot objectives, like I said, it's identify those requirements. We're going to focus on pre-disaster planning, mitigation, testing the model, and we're actually going to look at doing that in a limited scope way to look at a particular geographic area of interest or area of concern. And it might be, we'll discuss that with the pilot participants, and then actually engage. Our goal is to, after as we develop and test the viability of these model concepts prior to a more full scale, implementation of that. The idea is then to continue to engage and actually have, leaders and representatives of emergency management agencies from local, state, federal agencies continuing to have this conversation and engage in a global community of practice focused on equitable decision intelligence and emergency management. So tying all these things together to a broader conversation. Our expected commitment from jurisdictions is really to be, we're trying to be very minimally invasive with time, understanding that there's a lot of things competing for time here. Before the pilot begins, we're going to basically ask participants to participate in a 1 to 2 hour meeting where we identify and understand the current needs and sort of goals and outcomes, and then identify the available data and identify what data is inherent in that jurisdiction that can be used, plus other open data that can be leveraged at state, regional, national level. During the pilot, we're going to be looking for a couple of hours to engage in the validation of the model development. So Nisim will show you an example of what that looks like, where we've got basically some spreadsheets of here are the inputs, and it's sort of a validation and engagement in the model development itself, and just validating, yeah, this is what I am interested in tracking, and adjusting those data requirements in the process. And then actually, running the models and seeing what the outputs are. And then, after that process is complete, participating in another 1 to 2 hour discussion to evaluate, okay, what do we learn? What are the risks and issues, feedback on sort of, okay, here's what we thought we would get, and here's what we got. What does that teach us? How might we tweak and update the model? What problems does this help us solve that we didn't have visibility into before? What are the limitations? And what would be required to scale this and actually take this from an isolated scenario where we're testing and evaluating to something that handles multiple scenarios and multiple moving parts that are going on all at once. So the idea here is to really, it can be more involved or less involved. At a minimum, you're looking at probably, a day of your life spread out over, a couple 1 to 2 hour meetings. But it also could be far more involved if there's interest and desire, where we could get a lot more involved in, refining and developing those models. Next slide. And in terms of from the pilot organizers, what can you expect from us? And that is to really support and guide the participants during the process to sort of outline, here's what's expected, here's what we're going to do, here's the input, here's the expected output. Here are the conversations we're going to have, and actually coordinating and scheduling. We're going to work to understand the jurisdictional needs, understanding that every jurisdiction is different, and the makeup and demographics and challenges and historical challenges are different. And we're going to look at sort of leading the development and of the model throughout the process through an inclusive engagement process where we're going to invite as many people from your organizations as possible who are interested in engaging in shaping that modeling process. And then last, we're going to be involved in supporting the pilot organizations and engaging their stakeholders and leadership to solicit feedback to strengthen the model. The ultimate goal here, again, is we're going to be looking to pilot and test and evaluate this model that ultimately is going to be published as an open source model that can be used by people around the world. And we're going to crawl before we walk and then walk before we run. So there's going to be, we're very much focused on what does version 1.0 look like, and how do we get from here to there. So this pilot process ultimately is going to help us to set those parameters and to validate assumptions that we have going in. So with that, I'd actually like to turn it over to Nisim Titan from Forecast. He's going to talk to you about the model design itself and show you the sort of scope of the proof of concept and get into some of the more of the details. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Nisim.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. So first of all, let's go, please, to the next slide, Camila. So I don't know who participated in the workshop itself, but a little bit about Equitable Decision Intelligence Model. So as we talked in the past, a model is a framework that supports decision-making. And we have 3 core layers that build it. The first one is the data layer, that we have our attributes, metrics, key performance indicators, and our organizational model tree. The second layer is the analysis layer, where we will run incidents, scenarios, trying to forecast, different events, the outcomes of different events, where we will run thousands of times of different scenarios based on Monte Carlo simulation, for example. And the third one is actually the recommendations that we're going to support and provide according to mitigating a disaster, the events, the outcomes, and what happens during and after the event. Next slide, please. A little bit about the proof of concept. So we will try to focus on preparedness and mitigation. Those are, the 2 issues that we want to focus in the POC. We'll present the preparedness model for the Lifelines. So each jurisdiction that will work with us, we will show them, the first situation of their Lifelines. Then we will try to run 3 different scenarios, for example, flood options, and try to mitigate the disaster with predictive simulation. The idea is presenting the preparedness level of the Lifelines in each option, provide mitigation insights. For example, the damage, what happens, what's the damage to infrastructure, what will happen in each option, what's the difference between them, and different recommendations for preparedness, measures that can lower the risk and cost of mitigation and recovery. Next slide, please. So if you remember when we spoke about building the model, we mentioned 3 steps. And the first step was the end of the model. According to it, was defining the goals of the model. So in the POC, we won't define all the goals, but we will define the mitigation and disaster. Camila, if you can press the button. So we will mitigate the disaster. That will be one of our goals. We'll try to predict the damage and recovery costs. And of course, we will define and build the scenarios according to preparedness, where the idea is defining at least the main goals of our model and objectives, and the primary inequities and what actions would improve equity outcomes. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, we'll focus on flood. This will be the scenario of our POC. And the idea here is saying, okay, this is the risk, this is the hazard. Next slide, please. And we will work a little bit on the third step, that's our models. What kind of models? So we will have a few models, the Lifeline models, the service model, the readiness, and the core capabilities models, where the idea is saying, okay, this is step number 1. This is our preparedness level. Let's run it in some kind of scenario, 3 different options. What's the situation at the end? And which models can support our preparedness, mitigation, and resilience. And of course, this will happen before an event, during an event, and after an event. Next slide, please. So here we have some kind of illustration of a flood scenario that we ran in Baltimore. And immediately you can see that according to the height of the water, then we can see that MedStar Hubbard Hospital, for example, is in high risk. This means that our healthcare lifeline can be at a big risk, and what should we do to prepare for some kind of event? Next slide, please. A little bit about the process of the proof of concept and where we will need you guys to collaborate with us. So if you see the yellow square, so we will need to have some kind of GIS data or historical events data that you can provide us with. And we'll take all this data and input it in our model, where the idea is preparing the preparedness situation, and that will be based on the first draft of the Lifelines models, the core capability models, the readiness models that we will build together with you, and according to all your insights from the different workshops and our understandings. We will build the first scenario. For example, take some kind of city, some kind of area, some kind of neighborhood, and say, okay, this is the idea. We will have here 3 different flood options, 3 feet high, 6 feet high, and so on. And in the green square, we'll try to mitigate the disaster, providing 3 different options. What's the damage? What's the recovery estimation? And of course, at the end, where you see here the red square, the preparedness recommendation. So what should I do in my preparedness? What's the cost of it that can have less damage and mitigate the disaster itself according to the 3 options that I choose? Next slide, please. So here's an example for 3 different options, and you see in each option according to the height of the water, 5 feet, 10 feet, and this depends, you know, if it's a flash flood, for example, what kind of damage to infrastructure, what kind of damage to neighborhoods, what kind of damage to hospitals, for example, what's the damage to my lifelines, transportation, communication, safety, and so on, and what should I do? So if I have some kind of problem with one of my neighborhoods, so what's the demographic data, what's the diversity of the people, where should I evacuate them, and so on. There's a lot of different questions that will be answered with the model and will be part of our model description. Next slide. Here's an output, for example, 3 different options, the situation of the lifelines. On your right, you can see the decision intelligence insights and the recommendations that hopefully our model will provide. And of course, everything will happen with you guys together, and it will be fine-tuning of the model, and all your insights will be appreciated. Next slide. Here we can see some kind of recommendation about the transportation lifeline, and you can see the decision intelligence insights where you can see what happened to the bridges, what are the recommendations that we received from our models, what should we do? For example, 27 residents who need wheelchairs. So disabilities, what kind of insights we have according to our community, the diversity of the community, the understanding of what kind of team we need to have. So if we have in our community a lot of people that don't speak English, so we need to have someone in our team that speaks their language, and so on. Next slide. A little bit about the model itself. So the model itself that we're going to publish, the open source model, will have a framework of a few models. For example, community lifelines, incident response, mitigation, emergency management, services, operational planning. And we will provide also and publish in GitHub some kind of open source code that you can utilize and use according to our findings during this POCs. And just a simple example, so if you can see in the lower part of the slide, the mitigation model. So one of the things in the mitigation model is community resilience. And part of the understanding that we received here from different insights during the workshops was the diversity of our team, community training that makes some kind of communication with the community itself. I know my community better. My community, it believes in me. I can talk to them. A response plan adjusted according to the diversity of the community, people with disabilities in our operational planning, and so on. Joel, Eric, anything that you wanted to add?
No, thank you.
Awesome.
I think you know, Nisim, what you just outlined, I think is a great overview of what the plan is, and we probably have a few minutes if you wanted to show a little bit of one of the models that you could dive into, and then I think we've got some time for question and answer.
Okay, so I'll just share my screen and show one of the models. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so here's a little bit of a first draft of the framework of the model. So if we look at emergency management, it's built from prevention, protection, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And for example, if we drill down to mitigation, it's built from long-term vulnerability reduction, risk and disaster resilience, threat and hazard identification, and community resilience. And if we drill down to community resilience, so these are some very good insights. Team diversity according to community, response plan adjusted to the diversity of the community, evacuation planning adjusted to different communities, like we mentioned earlier, disabled people that need more assistance, need different equipment. We need to plan according to our community. Connection to the community, and of course, training. That is one of my major beliefs, that makes some kind of connection with your community and creates trust and transparency with your community. And that's the major thing. And if we go back and look, for example, in preparedness, so the model of preparedness will be built from emergency support functions, core capabilities, EMAP standards, building the preparedness itself, community lifelines, and incident report. And if we drill down to each one of them, so here, for example, we can see identifying and assessing risks, operational planning, different services, and so on. So this is a first draft of the model. This models will come also with different planning according to incident response, floods, pandemics, and of course, a little bit of open source code that will be supported and published in GitHub.
Yeah, thank you, Nisim. I think that looks really good. And so just to highlight that a little bit, the model making process is essentially augmenting and making those elements you showed relative to the community. So if we localize that, while ESFs may not apply, we can easily change the model for ICFs, different inclusions, different response postures, etc.
Right.
Awesome.
Right.
Now we'll continue to monitor the chat if you have any questions, and just a reminder, of course, that some of these resources, if you haven't already, sign up if you're interested for for a jurisdictional pilot. And to join our LinkedIn group, we'll also include the links in the chat as well for ease of reference. And of course, if you don't have any immediate questions and if you need more time to process and think about what we just discussed, you can always email us at equity@spainglobal.org. With questions or more requests. We'd love to have your feedback as we continue with this process. So I will give it a few more minutes. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat. But if not, we, on behalf of all of our this effort organizers and your contributions have been very valuable in this process, and we really thank you for your time and your engagement in this process, and we look forward to working with you in the future as this topic progresses, and we continue to of course to keep you in the loop as we move forward.